If you were surfing the net in the 2000s or just had a general presence around computers at that time, chances are there are a couple things that stood out. You had a digital space that was more or less full of free real estate. We finally had the capabilities to reach anyone around the world instantaneously, but we didn't have the temperament or experience to do it the way we do now. So there was this Wild West feeling too using computers, filled with ambiguity and uncertainty to where they were headed in the future. Culture of the time indirectly compensated for this through design, quite literally painting a picture for what they wanted the future of computers to look like. What you got was a bunch of glossy, photorealistic graphics of buttons and icons that resembled things from the real world, but were just artificial enough for you to know that you had just entered a new one. This unique style has retrospectively been coined the term Frutiger Aero, and for many, it is what you'd call a typical case of nostalgia, particularly for those who were coming of age during the mid-2000s. It represents a time where computers and the internet were simpler, a perfect symbol of the innocence and blissful ignorance of what the internet was going to become. If the internet today was a metropolitan city, in the 2000s, it was an underdeveloped field of wheat, full of so many amazing possibilities. And what if you could show that, quite literally? And when you put it like that, it seems that Frutiger Aero isn't just an aesthetic, but rather a mindset. And for that reason, its place in the digital world and even validity has been brought to question. Yeah, I would not have expected for Frutiger Aero of all things to be controversial, but it is. For many people, it represents what things could have been, how we were essentially promised something that we never received. And then you have the other side that disagrees with that premise entirely. And today we're going to talk about the origins of Frutiger Aero and why this contention even exists to begin with. Frutiger Aero is a great example of the type of things that we see when observing decodology. For those who aren't familiar, decodology is an unofficial term for the study of particular decades throughout history, primarily the 20th century, and the distinct traits we associate with them, and how they came to be. With the 70s, you think of disco and bell-bottoms, the 60s, hippies and psychedelic art, the gay 90s, athleticism, socialites and suffragettes, etc. These are not absolute and exclusive traits, of course, and there's much debate on when a decade culturally starts and ends. But decodology collectively chooses the traits that stand out the most and define these eras throughout history. At the end of the day, it's all completely made up. But it does give quite a bit of insight into human behavior. The reason these decades look the way that they do is often influenced by the technological, financial, and political conditions of the time, and the Frutiger Aero fad of the 2000s is no exception. In fact, I would even argue that the motivations behind Frutiger Aero's existence strongly parallel those that were behind the distinct traits of the 1950s.
Betty, how about some of those great hors d'oeuvres? Betty?
Don't rely on others to do your cooking, you lazy sack. That's when your pal HelloFresh comes in. Help you prepare food while saving time and money.
Me? Cooking? Do I seem to be wearing a skirt?
Nonsense, Ward. Cooking is for everybody, and HelloFresh makes it easy. With over 50 dinner options available, flexible for any lifestyle, you can have a rich variety of square meals, including free breakfast, for the rest of your life.
You mean to tell me I'll still be enjoying HelloFresh by the year 2000? Assuming meals don't come in pill form by then?
We understand that life gets busy, and not everyone has time for intensive grocery shopping, which is why HelloFresh lets you choose which meals to come to your door each week, including vegetarian options. Scheduling is also very flexible, and you can even skip weeks if needed, and the menus change along with the seasons, allowing you to truly experience different flavors of the year. Ingredients are fresh at your doorstep, and you can choose over 30 calorie smart and protein smart recipes to ensure that it is a square meal and not a square meal. This box came with vegan Thai coconut ginger curry, vegan mushroom and soy ramen, and complimentary bagels. If you fed this to someone from the 50s, they would die.
Well, I smoke 3 packs a day and only eat Jell-O. Doc says I'm doing fine. I've had some swell food before. I gotta say, this was the swellest.
That's wonderful, but there's no such word as swellest.
Well, gee whiz, HelloFresh. This wasn't an English sponsorship.
Click the link in the description or use my code to get 10 free meals plus free breakfast for life. One breakfast item per box while subscription is active if you're in the US. Outside the US, the local discount will apply.
Betty, better put down that skillet. I've got a bun in the oven. Now, where did I put those asbestos gloves?
Join America's #1 meal kit and start HelloFresh today.
There's nothing like HelloFresh. Square meals right to your door. Your door.
When we think of the 1950s aesthetic, we think of things that are clean, serene, predictable, simplistic. And now, several decades later, we often think that the 1950s were these things, and that everything was just sunshine and rainbows all the time. It wasn't. Not even close. I don't think I have to tell you that a lot of super messed up stuff was happening in the 1950s, but since mass media was very strict at the time, especially television and music, those things were often not talked about, if at all. And because the 50s were a very long time ago, we only remember the positive aspects of that period. This is known as survivorship bias, and it is a contributing factor to the very distinct style that we see at this time. I say contributing factor because the reasons the 1950s looked like that are very nuanced, and the environment of the time did contribute to it. It was the end of World War II, and the United States had the geographic advantage of being basically the only developed country that wasn't completely left to ruins. The war effort also got the country out of the Depression, so they had both nice infrastructure and a lot of money. This gave them more time to focus on improving themselves, and initiatives from President Eisenhower to create things like highway systems allowed for people to explore unoccupied land much quicker. Much of this land was turned into suburbs, which looked quite clean since they were brand new. And the uniform, cookie-cutter homes were not just a byproduct of the assembly line culture of the Industrial Revolution, they also symbolized familiarity and predictability. These circumstances created an ideal depiction of what living in America would now look like. Everyone could just go and start new, wealthier, better, simpler lives and raise their nuclear families. This ambition was flaunted and embellished in the artwork of the time. Just like how the designs and color palettes were clean, simple, and predictable, so was the American dream. We then saw this kind of repeat itself in the 1990s. The Cold War was now over. A recession indirectly brought interest rates to record low levels, a trend that would be seen throughout the decade. And so people once again had more money and less worry. Just like cars on the highway looking for unexplored land, those with computers were now on the digital superhighway looking for unexplored parts of a new technology called the internet. And again, you would then start to see this faux optimism, idealized depiction of life in many facets of the 1990s style. But computers in the 90s were not that good, though thankfully, because of Moore's law, computers were going to get better and more powerful. People just had to wait for it. And that was a big component of this attitude. It's at this time where you start to see a lot of CGI, 3D graphics. That's when Frutiger Aero starts to enter the picture. By the 2000s, machine capability had exponentially improved, and computers were much more accessible to everyday people. Once again, these circumstances were reflected in the aesthetics of the time. This was the most apparent in the year 2000, with the release of macOS X and their new cutting-edge interface design known as Agua. This was then followed by Windows XP's similar design in 2001. Say goodbye to the archaic, dull look of the 90s. Say hello to the embossed, gradient buttons of the future. They are appealing to look at. You could almost reach out and grab them. Subsequently, this became a huge aesthetic trend throughout the decade, the perfect embodiment of the new millennium. Following the release of XP, Microsoft wanted to take their OS to the next level, and right after the release of Windows XP, it was already being discussed that the next revolutionary version of Windows was in the works. Their name for it? Longhorn. Longhorn's development history is quite interesting, because when you start looking at Microsoft's overall objectives for the project, you quickly start to see a lot of things, becoming disorganized. For instance, Longhorn was initially just meant to be an interim release of Windows, basically just a small update to Windows XP, scheduled to be released very soon after. This would give them a little buffer to release their truly ambitious project codenamed Windows Blackcomb, which was scheduled to come out in 2002. But as you could imagine, having 3 versions of Windows come out back-to-back in about 1 year was going to be a lot for Microsoft. So they decided to just make Longhorn. It assumed all the planned features for the now disbanded Blackcomb and planned to be the big, revolutionary OS of the century. What Windows 95 did to Windows 3.1, Longhorn was going to do to XP. In many respects, it wasn't just going to be an OS. It would be like interacting with real-life objects, but on a screen, effectively eliminating the need to understand the intricacies of knowing how to use a computer, outside of just the click of a mouse. It was going to be what Microsoft Bob tried to be, but this time with much more ability and, most importantly, better graphics. In fact, a big part of Longhorn's marketing focused on the operating system's design. They called this design Aero. A very common typeface called Frutiger was used on many computers at this time, this of course being created by Swiss designer Adrian Frutiger. With these distinct styles often complementing each other in this period, you probably now understand where the term Frutiger Aero comes from. But obviously it was coined retrospectively. At the time it was simply Aero, particularly when referring to the designs Microsoft made for Longhorn. Much like how its scheduling was all over the place, Microsoft's vision for Longhorn was also all over the place. They had many different design concepts for the OS that they showcased as previews, but these didn't exactly match the builds of the OS that were leaked, which really just looked like XP with a slightly different look. Not to mention they had in mind all the features they kept adding onto the OS, like a new security architecture, a search system quite similar to macOS X's Spotlight feature introduced in Tiger, and a whole new storage system. This would require a ton of under-the-hood changes with the OS, and so people were skeptical that Microsoft was going to be able to even meet their deadline. And ultimately, they were right. Longhorn's release date kept getting postponed, and the code that made up the OS kept getting more and more tangled and convoluted. Things just felt bloated. It was an entire mess. This is what happens when you try to design an OS with next to no tangible plan. Even if the idea was good, the execution was terrible. Things got so messy that Longhorn was canceled completely in 2004. They essentially had to start from scratch at this point. They decided to only keep a handful of these features, the Aero theme being one of them. And keep in mind, it had already been nearly 5 years since a new Windows had been released. For the sake of time, they had to really water these features down. So 2 years later, we got Windows Vista, which was infamously unstable and a pain in the neck to use. Naturally, people were very upset. Instead of Longhorn, we got this? And that enthusiasm for Frutiger Aero came from these promises from Longhorn, which showed a much more interactive 3D environment. It looks less like a computer and more like a place, and only little bits and pieces of that ended up actually appearing in the finished product. It just wasn't the future people were expecting. But you know, perhaps it was just the wrong time, because this trend for Aero-style skeuomorphism did not stop at Windows Vista. It started to appear on websites, computer programs, television, commercials, basically every digital medium possible. We could make this the future everywhere. I mean, look at this design for old YouTube. So groovy, so tubular, so Aero. And it's in my opinion that Frutiger Aero would have its peak in around 2009, which would, not coincidentally, be the same year as the release of macOS X Snow Leopard. Just look at this eye candy. Gosh, it looks so good you kinda wanna lick it. Steve Jobs' words, not mine. But wait a minute, one is Frutiger Aero and one is Agua. One made by Microsoft, one by Apple. Agua focused more on reflective, abstract textures, literally like tiny water droplets. Aero focused more on combining these photorealistic graphics that simulated interacting with real-life objects. These are not the same thing, but they are similar. Where do you draw the line? Well, some would argue that you don't. Heck, these same people are wondering, is this even a thing? Does Frutiger Aero actually represent anything that we just talked about? Or is it just an arbitrary term that people have added to a much more broad concept that already encompasses all these attitudes, such as skeuomorphism? Well, JJ McCulla certainly thinks so in his video on Frutiger Aero. And JJ, I see you garnered some discussion here. I just had an idea. You should make a video about Technicolor. I think the world is ready for a very nuanced take on that subject. Who knows? Could be missing out. In this video, JJ argues that this is just a meaningless term indirectly conceived from nostalgia that shows up from people coming of age every 20 years or so. It was definitely a take I never pictured having, but it was interesting to hear, especially from someone a whole different generation than me. So I decided to have a talk with him. Hey man, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well.
Right now I'm playing a little game called How Many Cables Can One Outlet Handle Without Burning It Out? The winner keeps their security deposit. I wanted to explore the mind of somebody who was already an adult by the time Frutiger Aero had become a thing and shares no sentimental value towards it, or really any nostalgia for the early internet for that matter.
My name is JJ McCulla, and I'm a YouTuber based out of Vancouver, Canada.
If Frutiger Aero doesn't represent the computer culture of the 2000s, what do you think does?
I think it does represent the computer sort of nostalgia of that era in a way. I just think that we should probably sort of define it in a much sort of like broader term, right? So I feel like a lot of the Zoomers have this idea that sort of computer aesthetics of sort of the early 2000s were like fundamentally defined by a kind of like nexus of like water imagery and nature imagery. And I just think that the phenomenon is not that precise. But then you also saw a preponderance of all sorts of other imagery. You know, you saw things like Toy Story or Terminator or Jurassic Park, right? Like computer generated graphics were kind of everywhere, and they were representing all sorts of different things. You know, I think we can sort of fetishize sort of the Frutiger Aero type stuff as being perhaps more representative of overall sort of computer generated aesthetics than they necessarily were.
What are some examples of mid-2000s computer culture that you think kind of diverts from that style that makes it not as precise for that time period?
What were sort of the iconic Pixar films of that era? Can we remember?
I'm trying to think. Ratatouille, right? That was like...
Yeah, like Ratatouille. Like, is Ratatouille Frutiger Aero? Like, I don't think so. Like, it's very iconic.
That's fair.
The thing with Frutiger Aero is that it's a theory first, and then people are trying to find examples to kind of fit into the theory. You see a few very sort of stock images that are not really from anything specific that people recognize. Like, I'm tired of seeing these videos about Frutiger Aero that just keep citing the exact same like 5 pictures and saying like, oh, doesn't this prove that this thing exists?
Emailing my graphic designer. Give me 1 second. When I had initially watched JJ's video, my main takeaway from it was that nostalgia for Frutiger Aero was somewhat based on the premise that the internet is now bad, and that was the reason it disappeared. But then I learned that his stance went much deeper than that. Do you see the internet now as less exciting than it was back then?
I mean, like, I think the aesthetics of the internet are objectively better. Like, I'm sort of sentimental for how the internet was structured versus now, like sort of the pre-social media internet. But, you know, I'm not really nostalgic about the aesthetics. Like, it was just a case that like graphics were uglier, they looked worse, you know, it was much harder to get like nice high resolution photographs, and you know, videos were non-existent or really small and blocky, and they took forever to load. You know, I remember a very common cliche of sort of the early internet was you'd load up some website, and I think there's even a joke about this on The Simpsons, and like just everything is just animated GIFs everywhere. It's like, you know, the dancing baby from Ally McBeal, and you've got like some rotating 3D smiley face, and just like a lot of just kind of like corny stuff like that. And these graphics were all very ugly, and so I'm like, maybe that's a vibe unto itself, but it's not one that's necessarily appealing to me. Overall, I think JJ's video was insightful. While I don't exactly agree that the practice of creating labels like Frutiger Aero is inherently groundless, I do agree with the notion that it is okay to be nostalgic of things just as long as you also remember them as they were. I do believe that the sort of grim, cynical tone that sort of exists in the digital world right now with things like AI and dead internet theory certainly contributed to the disappearance of Frutiger Aero, but I don't think it's telling the full story. As JJ said, part of it is simply that trends just come and go, just like how disco isn't a thing anymore. Neither is Frutiger Aero. And I think a big part of it is people just quite literally got sick of it
and the environment that enabled that trend to exist to its full potential could now be used for something else. Why were the 1960s so colorful and psychedelic? Obviously, colorful things existed before, but the 60s took it to a whole other level, to the point where it's a trait that particularly stands out with that decade. Well, color TV finally became a thing, which made it easier to create media that was in color. In fact, 1967 was the first year where more color movies were made than black and white. With this new capability in their hands, they made the most out of it. There's a common hyperbolic joke that's tossed around among historians that in the 60s, everything was just black and white, and then one day people woke up and everything was in color. And in a less extreme, more spiritual sense, this is sort of true. There is quite literally a term for this phenomenon, the summer of love, because the political, technological, and financial circumstances of the time had this crazy social change occur over the course of just a summer. But eventually, color TV became so normal, people just got tired of all the colorful crap, and things got much more dull and gritty looking in the 70s and 80s. Frutiger Aero had the same fate, but with computers. CGI was getting so easy and so good, people finally had the chance to really take it to great levels, and so they did. Skeuomorphism was also a great way to take an intimidating, abstract concept like a computer interface and transform it into something that resembles the real world, so that non-tech-savvy people could understand how to use them better. But once CGI got so good, and once people got so used to how computers worked, the skeuomorphism style was no longer needed, and was starting to get old. So, something like flat design came in its place. The digital world could afford to be more abstract, and it was a fresher look. But now we're reaching the point that people are getting sick of this flat look, and further feel that it is also indicative of the current dull, bot-filled climate of the digital world. A monotone, uninspired design for a monotone, uninspired space. And I do think the best way to understand how and why trends come and go is by analyzing it at all angles. And sometimes the overclassification of things is part of that. It's simply human to put a label on everything, because we're trying to make sense of everything. It is part of our nature to eliminate any form of ambiguity. The overcategorization of things is something we've seen many times throughout history. In fact, the movie A Hard Day's Night from 1964 even jokes about this when discussing similar yet different music subcultures.
Are you a mod or a rocker?
No, I'm a mocker.
Whether these terms had any contemporary practical use or were coined retrospectively, that human condition is still there. It could very well be an inherent byproduct of the time as well. A comment on JJ's video pointed out that creating names like Frutiger Aero comes from the need to use keywords in order to search for specific things online, and I do think that's part of it. Perhaps by taking into account all these things and classifying them to the best of our ability, we can make the most sense of them and therefore use them to our advantage. Maybe this is how we can create that future that we saw with Frutiger Aero. And I don't think this is the end of Frutiger Aero either. With the rise of augmented reality, we are going to essentially come full circle and, in this realm, introduce 3D style graphics. Because not only will it make this new technology easier to understand, it is quite literally designed to take you to a cleaner, more idealized world. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you had to choose between mods or rockers, sometimes it's okay to just be a mocker. Oh, and you should support me on Patreon as well. Patreon.com/NationSquid. You could also buy me a skeuomorphic coffee for my future. A special thanks to my patrons and channel members for making this video possible. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you never miss a future video.